Welcome to Writer, a program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville, a program for and about writers. Today we have two writers, a married couple, Michael Trammell, who is a poet, magazine editor, and writing professor, and his wife, Mary Jane Ryals, who is a fiction writer, magazine editor, and also a poet. Now, is this unusual that two of you share the same profession in the same household? Are there many like you in the country?
I don't think there are, really. We know them because we know writers. But I think it's pretty unusual for two writers to be in the same household. It can be hard.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. I'm thinking of other examples. I mean, there's David Poyer, Lenore Hart. Michael Doris's wife is
Louise Erdrich.
Louise Erdrich and Michael Doris.
Not many of you around the country, huh?
No.
Is it a liability, do you think, or do you think that it helps you in your profession?
It's a little of both, I suppose. You've got two egos to contend with, so that can be a problem at times. And you can't always be the best responder that you would like to be sometimes to each other's work. I mean...
Well, how do you work? I mean, for example, if you're working, do you divide your time? Do you divide your house? I mean, how does that work?
We used to each have a room, and that worked really well for us. Now we share a room, and Michael seems to be, well, neither of us use that room, do we? We both use our offices now, come to think of it.
So you have your separate space.
So we do have separate space. Even though we set up our household to share a room, we use...
You don't.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right.
But you both also have offices at the university, right? Because you both teach writing.
Right.
So you have separate places there also.
But I write in bed. I do. It's the most comfortable place in the world, and that's where I write. That's interesting. That or the sofa.
Yeah. Now tell me about inspiration. Do you go to each other with the development of an idea, or do you? Where do you get your ideas?
I think we both have different techniques. I have a tendency, I guess, to work in isolation and work something through a little bit before I show it to Mary Jane. And Mary Jane likes to tell me about the bare bones things and get me in debate about it a little bit. And sometimes we get in a little bit of fights about that. And she starts putting it together. And
well, I would think that would be difficult. I mean, to accept criticism from your spouse. I mean, not that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I'll get so mad at him. I'll have this great idea, and I'll go to him and he'll say, yes, but, you know, he's the great doubting Thomas, and I'll be furious. How dare he, you know, not like this idea. And then I'll mull it over and realize he was absolutely right, and how do I deal with that problem, and, you know.
So you go to each other as your primary source. Do you go to other people also? I mean, what if Michael didn't like the idea? Would you go to one of your friends at the university and say?
That's a really good question. Every now and then, but usually I really trust his judgment about those things.
And you trust her judgment?
oh, yes.
So you do really, it is really a working partnership in that regard.
But you have to be careful because you can't really be as objective as you would like to be because, well, you have to live together, so you can't tell... I can't tell Mary Jane, well, this is awful, go back to the drawing board. This is just something good to have behind you, forget it. You know, you can't really say that to each other without...
So you wanted to say
being,
that, huh?
No.
You can bring it.
For example, you know, recently she's been working on a story about teenagers growing up during the Vietnam era. And she said, be very objective, be really hard on it. And usually I try to stay as positive as possible. And if I'm responding, I emphasize the good things and maybe an aside for something I might seem problematic. But she said, be objective. So I tried to be harder on it than usual, and then I don't know.
And what?
We had some differences in opinion.
So
it wasn't bad. It was just...
Did you accept his criticism? I mean, did you make those changes to your story?
Oh, yeah. I put it aside because I thought, oh, this is this is just not working right now. So I put the story aside and I'll go back to it later. I did pick it up a few weeks later and I thought, this is not a story. And I even said to him, this story's awful, you know, I need to do this and this and this and this. And he said, I can't remember, he said something about how I was being harder on it than he had been in the first place.
It's better when you get the other person, the writer themselves, to be harder on their work.
Actually be hard on their work.
It sounds like what you're talking about, though, is more than, I mean, obviously a married relationship, but it's a working relationship, and I'm assuming that other people have those kinds of people that they can go to say, you know, if they're not married, they have a person that they can take their work to and say, please respond to this. And if it's someone that they trust their judgment as you do each other's.
I think you're lucky if you have someone like that. For instance, I sent my mother a novel chapter, a first novel chapter, and she responded, but she responded in a way that, well, she wanted it to be autobiographical. She was looking for autobiographical details, and she didn't address the questions that another writer could address, like, is the plot moving along? Am I developing the characters well? Is there enough tension? Is there enough setting? Those kinds of things.
The kinds of things that Michael could do.
Right.
But your mother's not literary.
No, she was a.
Well,
in some ways she is,
okay.
but she can't answer those technical questions. And I think that people are really lucky when they get someone who really can do that and care enough about you and your work to do that.
Well, that brings me to another question. It's kind of a personal nature, if you don't mind. How did the two of you meet?
Oh, we were both at the writing program at Florida State, PhD doctoral writing program, and we were taking classes together and hanging out together, being apprentice writers together, and just kind of got together and had kids and got married.
You want to add to that, Mary Jane?
I remember, and Michael hates this story because we were in a poetry workshop together, and I had been in the program a few years, and he was new to the program, and I loved his writing. And I tell him that I wouldn't have fallen in love with him if I hadn't fallen in love with his writing. And he says, but what if I'd been a bad writer?
So really, then you became acquainted with Michael through his writing, I mean, in a sense.
In a sense, yes. Yes, which is in some ways the most intimate way, especially with poetry. You know, you learn someone's innermost thoughts, you know, their secret life, their other private writing life first.
And you both continue to write poetry?
I've written one poetry in a year, I think.
Yeah, but you continue to write poetry.
Right, yes.
Yeah. I was thinking, too, we were talking about relationships and having someone that you can go to for a critique, an honest critique. I mean, you're both in the university setting, and you both do that on a daily basis. So do you find yourself treating each other as you would your students, or do you can be much more open and frank? I mean, is it the same kind of mentoring that you would offer your students? Or how is that relationship different, I guess is what I'm asking.
It seems very different in some ways. But at the same time, it's similar because there's a balance between praise, you know, pointing out what's working well, and at the same time pointing out problems. Sometimes I find Mary Jane says I'm friendlier, more comforting to my students than I am to her sometimes, so I'm getting worried about that. Maybe it's because at the end of the day I'm all burned out and need a cup of coffee or something, but it's a balance.
I would say it's very different because students they're really learning just the basics, and we already know the basics. What we're doing is, when we read for each other, we're reading towards publication. How can I help him get this thing published? So it's more fine-tuning. It's not, well, here's how to develop a metaphor. It's much past that. It's much more.
But who then edits? Do you edit each other's work or proof it before it goes to an editor?
We don't do much of that. I guess we trust our own eyes and our own computers.
Yeah. It's a spell check wonder, right?
We can't always trust it, that's the
No,
thing.
you can't trust the spell check.
You still have to read things backwards, is the best way.
Yeah, and I've never ever tried the grammar programs that are on there. I just thought that that would be much too difficult. I don't know if they work or not. I don't know. Tell me about your children. You do have children. So what is the world view of children of writers? Is it different, do you think, from other children?
Well, we think maybe they're a little more cynical, but we don't know that for sure. We have a 3-year-old, Ariel, who's a hell of a personality and very stubborn and dogmatic and pretty much runs the house. And then we have a 11-year-old son, Dylan, who's more contemplative and usually agreeable, except about bedtimes. But he does writing. He writes...
The 11-year-old writes?
Yeah, Dylan writes kind of fantasy stories, kind of inspired by playing Dungeons and Dragons, kind of guys named Cobra and tough guy fighting orcs and trolls, and he gets pretty detailed about it.
Do you encourage him to do that? I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and we tell him his ideas are really good, and...
Has he submitted for publication?
No, he hasn't. Every now and then I'll tell him, look at this, poetry contest, or look at this, but he's not, I don't want to push him, I want him to do what he wants to do. He reads voraciously, and I tell my students who say they can't or don't have time to write a 4-page paper, that one day my son stayed home from school and wrote a whole story, which was a 1,000-word essay, which is a 4-page thing, and he's 11. So I don't give my students, my 18-year-olds, much slack, that way.
So your conversations at dinner, you don't think are terribly different from any other couple or family conversations at dinner?
Probably generally no, but it's probably a more subtle thing. We probably quote T.S. Eliot and silly things like that once in a while, but
So it kind of creeps into there.
Creeps in, probably. Yeah.
Do you use your children as story ideas?
I guess I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, you're the one who does that.
Especially in my poetry. I write a lot about my children and where we used to live in Tallahassee, Florida, a piece of land called the Keene property. Been working on those poems for a while now. The kids keep coming up as inspiration, and Mary Jane does too.
I know too that you use popular culture for story ideas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think popular culture is all around us, and if we pretend like it's not, then our fiction probably isn't alive. If we don't talk about McDonald's and the Brady Bunch, because they are all indicators of our time, then we're not really giving the full spice and flavor to the writing that it really deserves, because we are McDonald's and the Brady Bunch and all those, programs and movies and the music of our time. We are our time, and our time is us. So
you would encourage aspiring writers to look at popular culture for ideas?
The beauty of popular culture is that, it grounds things in a specific era, a specific setting, a specific place. And young writers, that's one of the main things you'll notice, is that their stories are kind of taking place in this invisible netherworld where you can't tell what's going on. There's a couple of talking heads, and that's about it. And
hobos in space is what we call them. People who are just sort of talking to each other, but...
And place really is a character, and one way to capture the setting in a time frame is to use things from that time frame. Songs, really, people connect songs with specific times, television shows with specific eras, films, certain fast food chains that lived and died within a certain era. All those things can really help for a reader place themselves, and it's a good technique for writers to use to help guide readers along to where a story is set.
Kind of develop the contextual kind of background, the fabric,
Which is often forgotten, I think.
Yeah, I know that you do some interesting things in workshops or perhaps in your classes where you have students go through identification of topics, or we were talking at one point about something you were doing with art, I think.
Oh, yeah, well, I like to have them pick a partner real quickly and draw them. And they say, oh my God, yes. And they say, oh no, I can't do that, you know. And but they can, because what they come up with is 2 or 3 or 4 characteristics of the person that distinguish them. And then, for instance, if I were drawing you, I would say, and your name is, and you would say Kathy Clower, and I would reverse your initials, C.K., and I would have to come up with a name, a fictitious name. Then the students all take their portraits up to the front of the room, and they walk around the room and have to choose a character to write about that's not the one they've drawn, so that we can take ourselves out of the world of reality and into the world of character, focus on creating a character. And I think that drawing helps them free up that side of the brain that's sort of free, just sort of loosens them up and towards writing and towards the imagination.
And then you develop your sense of place around that, or around that character.
Mm-hmm. And tension, too. I think characters, things will happen to characters because they are who they are. So I think most stories are character-driven, or most rich stories, to me, are character-driven.
And that's the point of the exercise, because like place, character development is another thing that's kind of forgotten. I mean, we're kind of a movie film culture. Films and movies are plot-driven, so people think narrative is mostly plot-driven as far as the form of the short story. And really, vast majority of successful short stories, there's very little going on. It's really about who these people are who are interacting. Mm-hmm. Doing the drawing exercise and figuring out who they are, like we'll ask students to say, well, figure out some things that make them who they are. You know, what's their hobbies? What's their favorite ice cream? What's their favorite color?
What kind of pets do they have?
You know, once you start to figure out that bit of material, and then the students start to realize that they're really kind of creating three-dimensional human
really
beings through their writing.
Imagination,
right.
I guess, in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, they have to like make it up.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, they have to make it up.
Yeah. Well, you're both in the academic world right now. Do you want to comment on that at all? I know that writers as professionals, I mean, it's difficult to make a living as a writer.
Right.
So if you are teaching, then perhaps that gives you an outlet to also write. But how do you find the academic world? Or is there a balance? Is it?
Well, as I usually do, I'm going to use an anecdote. One of the professors where I am now, we had a writer come visit, and to present the writer's material, the professor who was sponsoring her, gave us about 10 pages, and it was all newspaper articles and criticism about the work. It wasn't the work itself. And I believe that's really what academia is about in English. It's talking about creative work. It's not creating creative work. And I'm beginning to really see the distinction now that I'm seriously in the academic world. And for that reason, I don't think, despite what a lot of people think about the good, quote, good marriage between academics and the poet, I don't think it is a good marriage myself. It hasn't been for me. I think Michael has a different view of it, because he can write in the afternoon. When he's done with classes, he sits in his office and writes. I'm exhausted by then, because I've been giving all my energy to the students, and then I know I've got to go home and deal with the kids. And
so you don't have anything left over for your writing.
Right. And plus, I don't think the Academy really supports writing at all. Not until you're dead.
There are probably a lot of dead poets that would attest to that.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I think most academics are deeply suspicious of writers in the Academy, wondering what exactly we're doing there, and why aren't we producing scholarly articles. And our colleagues and friends in academia who are academics, critical writers, will say, well, you really should be writing a critical essay to get further along, to
Oh, I see.
get your tenure track position all sewed up and get yourself in there for good, get tenure.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're like, oh, a critical article. That's analytical thinking.
Right.
We want to turn off that part of our brain.
Right.
And that's what you've been encouraging
Right.
students to do all day, is
Right.
to turn that off.
Right, exactly. And
quite
you
a
know,
dilemma.
yeah, it is. And with the limited time you have anyway, then you have to think about, do I really need to write a critical article in order to keep my job? And to me, it's not worth it. I think for me, I think I would do better working as an active working writer, because writing for me is becoming a better writer means just practicing, and you can do that with journalism and radio and television, because you're required to do it all the time.
So you're not recommending, I've heard other writers say, you know, keep your day job, you know, whatever it is. So you're not recommending that your day job be in academia.
Right, I'm not, but I wouldn't.
But it works well for you, Michael.
At times. I mean, I do enjoy it. My father's a professor, so I guess it's in my blood.
You're comfortable.
I'm
in
a
the
better
environment.
conformer, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's enjoyable to work with students, and with good students, I often find that inspiring. But it's also, as Mary Jane points out, very draining, especially if you have to teach freshman comp where the students aren't very enthused, and you have to try to get them enthused, and
Try to
to
convince them
motivate
that
sometimes
they
it doesn't
need
work, and some days are just kind of flatliners. And it is a way to make money, though, for a writer to survive, because I mean, it's hard to survive on just pressing the keyboard and working and sending things out there. Most magazines and journals pay in copies, not in money. To get a book published is very difficult, and if you do, most advances on most first novels are about $5,000, and you'll be lucky to make another $5,000 after that. So you've worked 5 years on this novel and made $10,000. It's not a very
Right.
It's not a
lucrative
good
venture.
return. Yeah.
So yeah, I find teaching enjoyable, and it does take a lot of time, and you don't write as much as you would like. But I think I'd prefer teaching. I'm afraid I would find a 9-to-5 more draining, but I may eventually have to do a 9-to-5 at some point. But
I think part of this is, too, the way we grew up. My dad was an entrepreneur, and he would never think of taking a job in any bureaucracy, and was disappointed when I did. And I think he has been an influence on me, both my parents. They were both sort of had their own businesses, and I really enjoy writing for the masses. I enjoy, writing columns and writing newspaper articles and writing for radio. And Michael's writing is, I've noticed that his audience tends to be a literary audience, and I believe that's the way he grew up, is in a literary world. And I think that I can make a living doing it, a different kind of writing.
Different
yeah.
way, a different way. So as a business, you don't recommend that people go into writing to become rich and famous?
No, absolutely not. I think there are 100 writers in this country who are living on being writers. About 100. No, it's not.
We have just a few minutes left. Do you have any advice for the viewers out there who are aspiring writers?
They probably don't want to hear this, but it's a lot of hard work, and it takes constant practice, and it's that old cliche, 99% sweat or perspiration, 1% inspiration. But that's really true. I would add in there, I would say 90% perspiration and 8% stubbornness, pure stubborn. I'm going to do it anyway, even though the world could care less whether I do it or not. So that adds
2% what?
2%.
Hunger?
2% hunger.
Stick to what you want to do. Would you agree with that, Michael?
If you're going to be a writer, I mean, if you're going to write, you're not going to stop writing. I mean, it's not something that you kind of pick up as a hobby. You pick up a tennis racket and play a little bit and say, I quit. I mean, you just can't help yourself after a while, and you're constantly going at it every day, thinking about what am I going to do next? They say there's a lot of similarities between alcoholics and writers. You know,
Oh, no.
alcoholics ask themselves, you know, they're always thinking about where's the next drink. Well, writers are always thinking about when's the next time they're going to be able to write. And
Right. Very true.
have you ever had blackout spells because of your writing? You know, it's true. You're kind of in another world when you're writing there.
And a lot of it is in your head. You're thinking about your writing a lot. I'll ask him a question, and I know he's not really listening to he's half listening to the question and half writing a new poem in his head. And in that way, I understand him in a way that maybe someone who wasn't a writer does, and me, I think.
Well, that's good. Well, it's obviously a good working relationship that the two of you have. And I do appreciate you being here today. And thank you. This has been Writer to Writer, a program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville.